Hello to everyone entering the Zoom room. Before we get started with tonight's event, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. Tonight's event, if you'd like to purchase Say It Loud after the event or during the event on your computer, I will drop a link in the chat so you can buy the book straight from Politics and Prose. For our audience Q&A, make sure you place your questions in the Q&A box below at the bottom of your screen. And we also have on our live captions this evening. If you need to turn them off, that option is also at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lissa Muscatine, co-owner of Politics and Prose, and along with my husband and co-owner Brad Graham and our wonderful staff like Morgan, who you just heard from, we welcome you to tonight's edition of PNP Live. And I just want to say I am especially honored and joyful to be introducing our guest tonight, Randall Kennedy, who I met more than 40 years ago on a famous sailing vessel headed across the Atlantic to England, where we were both beginning our graduate studies. Despite some rough seas on the way over that left at least one of us a bit worse for the wear. Randy and I became friends on that voyage, and we've been friends ever since. And Randy, it's just such a joy to be able to host you tonight and celebrate the publication today, just came out today, of your new and 7th book, Say It Loud, on race, law, history, and culture. These guys are going to tell you a lot more about the book and about Randy's ideas, but let me just give you a very quick overview. It's really a superb collection of 29 essays that draw on Randy's work as a professor at Harvard Law School for the past 30 years and as one of our nation's leading public intellectuals, writing about hot button social justice issues, which he has done for years, from Black memorialization campaigns to the 2020 election, to George Floyd, to examinations of Nat Turner, the NAACP, Skelly Wright, Thurgood Marshall, other jurists. By the way, Randy clerked for Justice Marshall. Randy needles and cajoles his readers to interrogate their own biases and assumptions and cautions against the reflexive, glib, ideological posturing that dominates civic discourse today. This premium on honesty, common sense, and historical truth has been characteristic of Randy since the time I first met him, surely since his days at Princeton, at Oxford, and at Yale Law School. And it's why his singular voice is so important to understanding America's current political and cultural zeitgeist. I really can't wait for all of you to read Say It Loud. You get bonus points if you understand what the title refers to. And if you don't know what it refers to, then maybe even more reason to read the book. In conversation with Randy tonight is another special guest, a very, very special guest, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is a hero to so many in our community and to so many people across the country. I'm really proud that Congressman Raskin is my representative in Congress from Maryland's 8th District. Now in his 3rd term, he was a leader of the effort in the House to impeach Donald Trump for a 2nd time, relying on his background as a professor of constitutional law at American University to make an unsparing case that the then president violated his oath of office in inciting the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. We were all so grateful for Congressman Raskin's eloquence and brilliance during those hearings, and above all for the dignity and grace he displayed at a moment of tragedy for our nation and for his own family, only days after the loss of their beloved son, Tommy. And I just learned from Congressman Raskin a few minutes ago that he's actually finishing a book about those days, that period, and it's going to come out early in 2022. So take, that's going to be wonderful. And I'm sure everyone on this Zoom and beyond is going to want to read. I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm so glad you're writing that book. Anyway, it turns out that Professor Kennedy and Congressman Raskin also go back a long way. They were together as teacher and student at Harvard Law School. Randy also taught Tommy Raskin during his studies there. So it's sort of old home week here at PNP. I just want to thank you both so much for being here tonight to talk about this wonderful new book and whatever else you feel like talking about. And I hope that everyone in the audience will join me in welcoming the two of you, Professor Randall Kennedy and Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Well, Lissa, thank you so much. And what a delight and honor and pleasure it is to be here with the Politics and Prose community, with you, and with the great Professor Randy Kennedy, who was my professor when I was in law school, and also he was my son Tommy's professor as well. And Tommy did a fantastic Randy Kennedy imitation. You should know Randy. I don't know if you ever heard that, but he would come back from every class and imitate you, and he looked up to you a whole lot. So delighted to be with you. Let's start with this. This is off book, but you are a true Washingtonian, Randy Kennedy, and I wonder if you would reflect for a moment about your relationship to the federal city and how you grew up in Washington and how your family relates to the city.
Thank you very much. And before I proceed, I just want to say how delighted I am to be with this community. This is a homecoming for me. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. I was born in Columbia, South Carolina in 1954. My parents, like so many Black people in Washington, D.C., were refugees from the Jim Crow South. They fled Jim Crow to come to Washington, D.C. I grew up in D.C., and it was very important to me. I remember the politics of Washington, D.C. I remember the first person for whom I voted in a real adult election was Marion Barry when he ran for the school board. So growing up in D.C. was very important. It had a big impact on my political development.
Yes, indeed. And you write all too sparingly in a couple of these essays about your father. I'm thinking specifically the essay about racial pessimism and racial optimism, and should we be optimistic or not? And you describe your father as an extreme racial pessimist who thought that America was basically a hopeless basket case, that white people had bought into all of the myths of racial superiority and cruelty and oppression, and that was undislodgeable. But you became what you described as much more of a racial optimist, much more optimistic about where the country could go. I wonder if you would reflect in more detail about how that happened with you, and maybe canvas a little bit the journey that you discuss in that essay.
Yes, well, my father, whom I revere, is a great man, he was from Louisiana, and he had a very harsh upbringing. My parents met in South Carolina. He was in the armed forces. My mother was quite young. They were great parents. They brought their kids to Washington, D.C., tried as hard as they could to give their kids opportunity, a good education. My father was, yes, thoroughly pessimistic. In his view, the United States of America had betrayed Black people after Black people had over and over and over again stood by America. Even when they were being mistreated, African Americans stood by America and tried to advance American interests. And he never forgave the United States for that. I mean, here he was a Black man in uniform, who couldn't go places where German prisoners of war could go. And he had friends who were deeply mistreated. He was deeply mistreated, and he did not get over that. Now, one thing about him was that he definitely presented us with his views, but he was also a person who, he was not dictatorial, he was not authoritarian. We developed our own views and we debated them. And I reached a somewhat different view. Why? Well, in part because, I saw change in American life, quite dramatic change in American life. The opportunities that were open to me and my brother and my younger sister were very different than the opportunities that were denied to my father and mother. And so, when I was coming up, I saw a trajectory upwards. I definitely saw, to use the title of John Hope Franklin's, wonderful history of African Americans, I definitely saw a story, a quite dramatic upward story of from slavery to freedom. And, so I had a different view. And I have had a different view for years and years. I've been a quite confident racial optimist. As you know from reading my book, that view has been shaken. I'm still in the optimistic camp, but frankly, no longer with the confidence that I once had. I no longer chastise as strongly as I once did racial pessimists, because frankly, in the past few years, we've seen a side of the United States that I had thought was securely in our back mirror. We've seen a cruelty, we've seen an ignorance, we've seen a racism that gives me pause, gives me more than pause. It really puts a shadow over things. And I wrote these essays, and I am speaking now in that shadow.
You catalog people you consider thinkers and activists who are racial pessimists and those who are racial optimists. And I thought it was a fascinating taxonomy you put together in those two groups. Who would you say is your favorite racial pessimist, other than your father, and your favorite racial optimist?
Among the pessimists, and by the way, the pessimistic camp is in many ways the most interesting. It's the widest, because pessimists would include Thomas Jefferson, would include Abraham Lincoln, would also include Elijah Muhammad. It's very broad. Amongst them all, I would say that actually it's a foreign observer would be my favorite pessimist, Alexis de Tocqueville. In Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he has a wonderful chapter called The Three Races in America, Three Races of America. And he says that there will never be racial equality in the United States. He says, I come from an aristocratic society. I know what ranking is about. And his view was that in the United States, everyone would always know that the Black people had been slaves. No matter what happened, even if there was emancipation, people would know that Black people had been enslaved. And he said, there's the poison. And he was thoroughly pessimistic. And quite eloquently pessimistic. So he would be my favorite, I put that in quotation marks, pessimist. In the optimistic camp, there are, in the 19th century, the great voice of optimism would be Frederick Douglass. Even before the 13th Amendment, that is to say, even before the abolition of slavery, Frederick Douglass was asked, do you think there will come a time when there will be true equality in the United States, when there will be true fellow feeling in the United States, when whites and people of color will view themselves on an equal basis as neighbors? And he said, yes. Now here's a man who had been enslaved, had the scars of slavery on his back. He said, yes. In the 20th century, the great spokesperson for optimism would be Martin Luther King Jr. And, read once again or listen once again to Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream. It's a great, it's really a great hymn to the United States. It's one of the great patriotic proclamations. In the 21st century, a very important spokesperson for optimism would be Barack Obama. So, there's the pessimistic camp, there's the optimistic camp. Both of them, I think, have something to say about American history and about our present. And I think what I try to do in my essay is to put my mind around both traditions.
And we should say, before moving on, that Frederick Douglass was not only a great Marylander and later a Washingtonian, but he was also formerly a pessimist, right? As you point out,
Absolutely.
He was wrapped up with William Lloyd Garrison, and he was very cynical and pessimistic about the Constitution until he developed a completely different view of what was going on in the Constitution, that the framers went as far as they could to purge slavery from the Constitution and thought that it would die out.
You're absolutely right. That's one of the things that's so great about Frederick Douglass. I mean, Douglass was willing to change his mind. Douglass really, he occupied a wide range of positions. He was very restless. He was like, he presaged W.B. Du Bois in that way. And that is, he was searching for a way upwards. And so he would find a path, he would go as far as he could. When that path seemed to be blocked, he would try to find another path. And so, he had this intellectual restlessness. He was constantly going from this way to this place, trying to find a path upward.
Do you think that characterizes your own intellectual journey too? Because you've written for the New Republic, you've written for The Nation, you've been considered a man of the left, you've been considered a neoconservative, you've been attacked on all sides. Is that because people are misunderstanding you, or is it because you're willing to follow ideas where they take you at particular moments in time?
Well, I think it's probably all of those things. I certainly think that my students in the past few years have misunderstood me in certain ways. Some of my students, particularly my most progressive activist students, think of me from time to time as rather conservative, which makes me chuckle. I mean, I tell them conservative. In the American political spectrum, I'm way, way over to the left. I mean, if I were in charge of things, I would redistribute power, funding, opportunity downwards quite radically. But because I do insist on criticizing certain elements of progressivism, students, I think, sort of view me sometimes as a sort of a, curmudgeon who is a bit conservative. So, sometimes I think I am misunderstood.
Well, this leads nicely into the chapter of your book about Derek Bell, entitled Derek Bell and Me. And obviously, you had a long and passionate and sometimes tempestuous friendship with Derek Bell, who was your colleague at Harvard for a long time, and then he left. But you always wrestled with his ideas, and I think he with yours. Tell us, why was it important for you to write this essay?
This essay, I think it's the longest essay in the book, did mean a lot to me. This essay has never been published before. And Derek Bell was the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. He's often spoken of as the sort of the godfather of critical race theory. He left Harvard Law School because he issued Harvard Law School an ultimatum. He said, listen, you have to hire a Black woman tenured professor by a certain date or I'm leaving. That did not happen. He left. He ended his career at New York University Law School. And we were friends. In fact, it was I took over his course. He taught a course at Harvard Law School. He called it Race, Racism, and American Law. And when he left Harvard to become the dean of the University of Oregon Law School, I was asked whether I'd be interested in teaching that course. And I tried it, I liked it, and I taught it. In fact, you were in that course.
I was in that class with Michelle Obama.
Yeah, well, I remember that. That was very important to me. And he and I had we were close. Personally, we were close even when I started criticizing his ideas, which, by the way, he did not like. He did not like that at all, but I did, and we clashed rather sharply on paper, but we were always friendly. And I try in this essay to bring out the complications of our relationship.
Well, it relates to the optimism pessimism thing, because I think there's a deep strain of pessimism in Derek Bell's thought.
Absolutely.
About the ability of America to reform itself. His critique of Brown versus Board of Education, that there's no way that the white community would ever really accept integration. And so it would have been much better to make separate but equal real and really demand equality of resources and so on. But I wonder if there's a subtext to your essay and your relationship that I want to press you on a little bit, just because I've been raised by Randall Kennedy, so I want to ask the hard questions, okay? I wonder to what extent the real difference between you and Derek Bell is that he maintained a fundamentally oppositional attitude towards the academy, towards legal academia, and he felt that he needed to constantly challenge it and probe it and interrogate it, whereas you are seemingly a natural-born academic, a professor. You love academia. You love seeing all sides of all things, and you maintain, the customs and the traditions of academic civility that he didn't, because he always wanted to push the institution. And is that really the fundamental difference between the two of you guys?
That is one difference. I don't think it's the fundamental one, but I think you are putting your finger on something. Our experiences in legal academia were very different. Derek Bell came to Harvard Law School. He was the only Black professor there for a good long time. And frankly, he felt like he was an outsider, and he was treated as an outsider. Even after he got tenure, there was always a sense, it was grudging. It was grudging, and he knew it, and he
had not gone to Harvard Law School.
No, that was another, at Harvard Law School, especially when Derek Bell came, and Derek Bell came in the late 1960s, 90% of the professors at Harvard Law School had gone to Harvard Law School. Every now and again you'd have, a person who had maybe gone to Yale, maybe gone to Columbia, but that was it. It was overwhelmingly Harvard. He went to the University of Pittsburgh Law School. He had been an attorney. He had worked in the Justice Department. He worked in the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But he was an activist at heart. He was an activist at heart. He was a civil rights person, and that was that. And so he comes to Harvard Law School. He's viewed as something of an outsider. And again, he wrote. He was a very committed to teaching, very committed to his writing, but he was always on the outskirts. And I think that, yes, that had something to do with his feeling. Me, on the other hand, you know, I went to Yale Law School. I clerked for J. Skelly Wright. I clerked for Thurgood Marshall. I was on the Yale Law Journal. I come to Harvard Law School, and I had a very conventional background for Harvard Law School. I was treated very well. I'll say to anybody, my time at Harvard Law School has been absolutely wonderful. I have loved my experience at Harvard Law School. With very few exceptions, I have been treated wonderfully by my colleagues. And so, yeah, my attitude towards legal academia and Harvard Law School in particular is very different than his. And I think that has something to do with our differences. There is, you know, when I went through that, you know, pessimistic tradition, I should have included Derek Bell. Derek Bell is absolutely an important voice in the pessimistic tradition. He has a theory, his theory of the permanence of racism. He doesn't mess around. He says, listen, I was part of the Second Reconstruction. I was part, he was hired, by the way, at the Legal Defense Fund by Thurgood Marshall. He says, you know, I've fought the good fight, but when I think about it, I've come to the following conclusion. We shall not overcome. And, you know, make your peace with that, continue to struggle, but be realistic. And his view of realism was to recognize that there is the permanence of racism, the permanence of racial hierarchy in the United States. I viewed things differently, and we clashed about that.
I got to ask you, Randy, about the memorials and the monuments, because I found this to be a particularly fascinating essay in here. But you say at one point that you would have been fine with your alma mater, Yale, keeping the name of Calhoun College, named after John C. Calhoun, the great apologist for slavery. And you also expressed ambivalence about Princeton getting rid of the name of the Wilson School. And the country's going through this wrenching debate, and I think real transformation about this. I mean, my own attitude is somewhat different just because I feel like there's so many worthy people we could be naming schools and colleges and buildings after. To me, it's almost like term limits. Like, let's take turns. And, you know, it's not to say that people who participated in racism or slavery are 100% bad, but they also don't have to be our heroes forever. We can move on from there. So I'm just curious if you would explain your attitude about that.
Sure. Let me start off with your last point. We have lots of buildings. We're constantly, you know, new buildings go up. That's right. We ought to be putting the name of Fannie Lou Hamer and John Lewis and Medgar Evers and you know, there are plenty of people, Rosa Parks, Marion Wright Edelman. One could go on and on and on. There are heroes, both with us and still with us, who we should be memorializing, and I'm all for that. I am absolutely all for that. So that's point number one. Point number two, with respect to heroes, listen, if you're in Washington, D.C., you see the monument to George Washington. You can't miss it. George Washington was a slave owner. Horrific. George Washington was also, in my view, a pretty extraordinary person, and a person who had a type of politics from which actually people around the world can still learn. Here was a person who was essentially offered kingship, rejected it. No, I'll step down.
Well, he didn't reject it as a slave master. He was a king in his household.
He was, yes, he was, and that was horrible. But my point is that, somebody says to me, what's your view of George Washington? My view of George Washington was that he was part of a horrific social system. Yeah, terrible. He also participated in an extraordinary event in world history and exhibited personal qualities and political qualities that were actually quite admirable. John, let me jump to John C. Calhoun, because that's the one that really sticks in the craw of people who've read this essay. I say this about John C. Calhoun, fellow South Carolinian. He didn't just apologize for slavery. He said that slavery was a positive good. That's what he said. That was his sort of claim to fame, the idea of slavery being a positive good. Absolutely, absolutely horrific. One of the things about John C. Calhoun and Calhoun College, there was a professor, the first Black professor who was a master of a college at Yale, was the master of Calhoun College. In fact, he said he wouldn't be the master of any other college other than Calhoun. And he got a kick out of being the master of Calhoun College. I like that. I like that turnabout. I like it. You talked about Woodrow Wilson. I went to Princeton. I would eat in the building named after Woodrow Wilson. And when people ask me, I knew about Woodrow Wilson and his support for segregation. Terrible. I frankly got something out of a kick of seeing Woodrow Wilson's name up there and his portrait. And I'd look at Woodrow Wilson, and my attitude was, "How you doing, Woodrow Wilson? Didn't think you'd see me here, did you? But I am." And I didn't feel put down. I didn't feel put down by Woodrow Wilson. I felt actually good that people had engaged in a struggle that enabled me, Black Randy Kennedy from South Carolina, to go to Princeton right alongside of people whose, grandparents or great-grandparents had been slave owners. And frankly, I took inspiration from that. I didn't need to, get rid of Woodrow Wilson's name. I feel whole and good with Woodrow Wilson's name being up there or without it being up there.
Mm-hmm. So just to complete the point, I mean, this is a political struggle that's not just taking place in Ivy League colleges, obviously. And this is going on in Virginia right now about the Robert E. Lee statute in Richmond. And you saw what happened in Charlottesville.
Yep.
The memorials to Confederate traitors to the Union, including in the Capitol, have become a principal dividing line in the new racial politics of the 21st century. I was sitting on the House floor on January the 6th when the Capitol was overrun by basically a pro-Confederate mob. And the very first picture that was texted to me was of the guy carrying the Confederate battle flag inside Statuary Hall. And that never happened during the Civil War. Lincoln redirected troops from the battlefield to protect the Capitol so there would never be a Confederate invasion. And if you look at that picture of the guy carrying the Confederate battle flag, who's looking down on him is John C. Calhoun, who was a traitor, to the country and, the great architect of slavery. And then also looking down on him is Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who was the great abolitionist senator. So I don't know. I mean, I'm with you. I love the image of, young Randy Kennedy looking up and saying, well, look where we are now. But that's not the message that everybody takes from it. And I'm just wondering, whether you would reflect on Charlottesville and on the fights going on in Virginia about the Confederate war heroes.
Listen, I am so glad that you put it straightforwardly. Yes, the Confederates were traitors. They were traitors. And what does it say that you have at United States military bases people who took up arms against the United States military? I mean, I want it all to be out there. I don't want any sugarcoating, so I don't object to anything that you said. I think that the people who have been, attacking the Confederate monuments, the Confederate memorializations, I'm certainly not going to invest a whole lot of my time in criticizing them. They are anti-racist, good. Caution. Here's a caution. We only have, every day is you have 24 hours a day. You have limited energy. You can't do everything. There has to be a politics of, what do you invest in? Sometimes I think that there has been, in my view, an over-investment in certain sorts of cultural fights. And I think sometimes, with respect, George Washington, so do I really want people to spend a whole lot of time mobilizing to create a movement to, get rid of the, Washington Monument? No, I don't, because, listen, we got other things to do. You got other things to do, which, as far as I'm concerned, are more important. And I think that what can we do with the Washington Monument? We can put it into a context so that allows us to understand the horrific nature of slavery, which allows us to understand Washington's involvement in it, and that also allows us to derive inspiration from changes that have been made and inspiration to create new changes that need to be made. So that's sort of my view.
I want to ask you a question about critical legal studies and critical race theory. When I was at Harvard Law School, they were both very much in their heyday in the 1980s. And to me, it's a great irony that 30 years later, when there's not a lot of talk about either of them on law school campuses, they've suddenly become the political flashpoints in school boards across the country. But I two questions for you about this, Professor Kennedy. One is, do you think that some of the more radical theses of critical legal studies have actually been borne out by the complete politicization of the law under the right-wing takeover of the Supreme Court and other courts? I mean, is there really anything wrong with somebody saying that law is now just purely politics by a closely neighboring means? And then two, what do you make of the attempt to demonize and vilify critical race theory specifically, and what should people be doing in order to defend intellectual and academic freedom around the country?
With respect to critical legal studies had a lot to teach us, and frankly, it was very effective. One of the reasons why one doesn't hear as much about critical legal studies nowadays as when you were in law school is because, frankly, it's been, it is seeped into legal.
It's been absorbed.
Thinking. It's become accepted. And, what you were talking about, one aspect of critical legal studies was actually, it was a reiteration of an older idea, which was just legal realism. Let's be realistic about, for instance, what the Supreme Court is. You didn't have to be a critical legal studies person to understand that the Supreme Court of the United States is, of course, a political institution. They said it, they said it, they theorized it, they pushed the point but it was a good point. I accept the point. I think it was and I learned a good bit from critical legal studies. I said a moment ago that I'd had a good relationship, and I've been very happy at Harvard Law School, and that's all true. It's also true that Harvard Law School, and it's a bad thing. Critical legal studies was blocked at Harvard Law School. There were people on the faculty of Harvard Law School who should have been promoted, who should have been brought into Harvard Law School, who were not. Why? Because they were viewed as followers of critical legal studies, or they were too close to critical legal studies. They were
purged, really.
Yes, there was an ideological purge. There was an ideological blockade that was superintended by people who were, basically liberal in their orientation, and that was a bad feature. I just want to put that out there. Now, you asked about critical race theory. There's a way in which critical race theory is the story of critical race theory is somewhat similar to the story of CLS insofar as critical legal studies. There's a big part of critical race theory that is, I think, absolutely correct, and that a lot of people in academia and beyond would embrace. I mean, if the central idea of critical race theory is that racism in American life has been absolutely central. It is pervasive. Whether you go to, sort of intimate association, I don't care, friendship, sex, marriage, or the most public spheres, electoral politics, the selection of juries, the employment realm. Everywhere in American life, race and racism is there and it's been very important to the shaping of America. Well, you don't have to be a critical race theorist to believe that. I certainly believe that to be the case. Now, critical race theory, I think, in part to sort of, situate itself and make itself known. There are people in critical race theory who push ideas beyond a place that I think is tenable. I think that people push ideas sometimes, in academia, you gotta be different to get notice. And so sometimes people push ideas, and I think that these ideas are just, not so good. So, the idea, for instance, that, Black people cannot be racist because, after all, Black people occupy, in general, a lower position in American society than white people. Well, no, I think that's untenable. There are Black people who occupy positions of considerable power. In the last, for 8 years recently, the president of the United States was a Black American, for goodness sakes. Come on. Can Black people have vices like racism and do damage to other people? Yes. And people who, and I've said that, and I don't back off of that. I have my criticisms of, critical race theory. I think people have, gone too far in certain ways. But let me attend to your last question was, what do I think of the right-wing attack on critical race theory? I'm totally against it. I'm horrified by it. And people, I don't care where you are ideologically, you should be against the effort to banish critical race theory. And I'm happy to say there are some conservative academics who have raised their voices to criticize the right-wing attack on, progressive racial thought. If you are a champion of freedom of thought, if you are in favor of freedom of expression, if you are in favor of academic freedom, if you want schools and colleges and universities that welcome debate, you should be against the right-wing attack on critical race theory and other forms of progressive racial thought.
Lisa, how are we doing? Can I keep going, or do you need to break in?
You can keep going. You have
All right.
yeah, keep
Well,
going. There are a couple
I-
questions, Jamie, in the Q&A from audience.
Okay, great. But I just have one or two more questions that I get the chance to ask Professor Kennedy. One is, tell us about why you love the essay form so much. I remember back when I was your student, constantly reading essays by you, op-eds, you were always doing that kind of stuff. A lot of law professors look down on that and think, well, that's not serious scholarship. But actually, that may have been one of the things that critical legal studies and critical race theory opened up. I know certainly Derek Bell was someone who, experimented with different forms. But why do you seem to take so much to the essay form?
One reason is because I've always loved magazines. I've loved magazines, and especially when I was in college, I read just complete histories of magazines. I would read through all of the back issues, for instance, of Partisan Review, that was one of my favorites. Dissent magazine, one of my favorites. The last paper that I wrote in college was a paper about a magazine that only lasted 2 years. It was Politics. It was edited by Dwight MacDonald in the 1940s, and so I've always liked magazines. I.F. Stone's Weekly, and I got to know I.F. Stone a bit. Good Washingtonian. I've always liked the sort of the short form. I've written other sorts of things. I've written, law review articles and books and, other sorts of ways of communicating with people. But you're right. I've always liked the essay form, and some of the people who have meant the most to me intellectually have been people who were essayists. I think of I.F. Stone. I think of, the great W.E.B. Du Bois. I think of Dwight MacDonald. I think of Irving Howe. I think of Lionel Trilling. So that's why I grew up reading essays. I grew up reading magazines, and that has stuck with me.
Well, you just named 5 people, and none of them was a law professor. So that's interesting, or even a lawyer, I think. But that's intriguing because you have, over the course of your career, I think, developed more and more as a national public intellectual, and not just a doctrinal law professor. And some of that is, I think, your natural intellectual inquisitiveness and wanderlust. But part of it is also what's gone on with the courts. I mean, Professor Tribe just stopped doing his treatise. He said, he doesn't want to give more credence to the doctrinal structure than really exists. I mean, it's like you're dealing with a town council when they put a bunch of right-wingers on there who just vote according to their politics.
Well, again, I mean, we live in perilous times. I've never felt more trepidation in all my life than in the past couple of years. And you talk about the courts, and you specifically allude to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States is a tribunal that is now quite unfriendly, to the partisans of racial justice, quite unfriendly to the partisans of gender justice, quite unfriendly to organized labor. We have a reactionary Supreme Court, a reactionary faction that dominates the Supreme Court, probably the most reactionary person in that faction is a person who I criticize quite harshly in my book of essays, namely Justice Clarence Thomas. And there is good reason to view the Supreme Court with trepidation, and I do.
Let me ask you finally, Randy, about Justice Thomas. There's certainly enough there for anyone to criticize just as a matter of constitutional and legal interpretation and the inconsistency of his deployment of different ideas, which I think you could also tax Justice Scalia with and the other conservatives. But Justice Thomas has come in for an extra strain of critique, which comes out of the school of thought and sentiment that you call racial solidarity. Some people view Clarence Thomas basically as a race traitor. And is that a legitimate critique, or is that really beyond the pale? His opinions and his decisions in voting should be considered quite apart from, the color of his skin and where he comes from.
This is a point on which I've changed my mind. There was a time, I wrote a book a number of years ago called Sellout: The Politics of Racial Betrayal. And in that book, I took the position that actually to criticize Justice Thomas in the way that you just articulated was, I thought, wrong. I've changed my mind. I think that Justice Thomas ought generally to be ostracized. I think he ought to be particularly ostracized by Black Americans. One reason I do, I might have a somewhat different position if Justice Thomas had said, listen, don't treat me any differently than any other American. There's nothing special about me racially. That's not what he said. No, when Justice Thomas got into trouble in his confirmation hearings, talk about pulling the race card. I'm a Black American. They're mistreating me because I'm a Black American. This is a high-tech lynching. He invoked racial solidarity. And by the way, it was very effective. There were a whole bunch of people who disagreed with Justice Thomas about various things, but basically said, well, I might disagree with him, but he's a good brother and he'll come around. Well, he hasn't come around. And in fact, he has taken positions that are completely to the detriment of Black America. Most particularly, he contributed to the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was his worst.
You're talking about Shelby County versus Holder.
Shelby County versus Holder, absolutely.
And the Brnovich decision recently.
And it reverberates. I mean, at this very moment, we're seeing voting rights under siege. Now, so
part of the point you just made is that if he's going to appeal to racial solidarity in both coded and very overt ways,
yes,
then the turnabout is fair play. At that
absolutely. Point. And if you read interviews with him, if you listen to him talk, he talks. His view is he's a race man. He's just a misunderstood race man. My view is, okay, fine. If there is such a thing as a good brother, there must be such a thing as a bad brother. If there's such a thing as, I am a racially loyal, if you say that, then there must be such a thing as you're racially disloyal. And so I stand by my critique of Justice Thomas, and I say straight out, that's right. he ought to be ostracized for the positions he's taken. I'm not saying that he's a bad person. Actually, he's a very personable person, very, very courteous. I'd say in my essay, I bet that he would make a good neighbor in many respects. But in terms of politics, he ought to be shunned and he ought to be criticized in the harshest way.
In terms of law and politics.
Yes. And by the way, he is a political figure. I mean, he's a political figure no less than a senator or a member of the House of Representatives. He does his politics using a different language, different customs. He has a different venue. And he does it, his politics are in a different register. But are all of the justices, I'm not just talking about the liberal justices, are they political figures? Yes, they're political figures. Sure.
Yeah.
They are.
All right. Well, my turn is up and we get to go to the audience now. What a pleasure it's been. And I will just testify that Randy's book is filled with provocative insights that will edify you, even if he's going to change his mind 20 years from now about it. You're going to learn a lot from it. So let's go to the first question if we can.
Or I can read it.
If you would, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So what overall message would you like readers to get from your essay collection?
Well, if I had to choose one, it would be that the race question has been central, is central. It's a complicated issue that requires study and that requires a taste for complexity. That's how we would respond. And while I've got the floor, I simply want to say, Lissa, thank you so much for making this venue available to me. And thank you so much for sustaining your bookstore, which is a great bookstore, and not just a great bookstore, but an important institution in our democracy. Your bookstore and other independent bookstores, absolutely essential. So keep on doing what you're doing. And again, thanks so much for having me on.
Let me see if I can come back on here. I'm not able at the moment to start my video, but hopefully I'll reappear. For the moment oh wait, here we go. I'm gonna start now. Sorry about that, guys. Randy, thank you. That was really kind. And our community supports this bookstore because our community believes in the importance of having a marketplace of ideas and having a place where people can join together in conversation and debate and discussion and hopefully disagree vehemently and rigorously but respectfully. And that's what we try to do at Politics and Prose. This is a great event. Thank you both so much for doing this tonight. Congressman Raskin, you are a pro. You better be careful. We're going to have you back to moderate more conversations. Again, we cannot wait for your book to come out. I'm so glad you're writing it. And Randy, it's always good to see you. We wish you were still in DC, but we know you love being in Cambridge. And the book is it's great. Oh, I have can I ask one question before we stop? Just because you ended on the Supreme Court, I know a lot of us are really wondering about Stephen Breyer, and you talk in your Thurgood Marshall chapter about Justice Marshall's decision to leave the court when he did. And of course, he was replaced by the aforementioned Clarence Thomas. What do you think about Breyer holding on at the moment? And would you have any words of advice for him?
Yes, I have words for advice. I have words of advice. Retire immediately. And I am frankly, I'm disappointed that he hasn't already retired. He needs to retire for the good of the country.
Why is it so hard for these people to do that?
Well, it's a wonderful job.
Yeah.
They are, it's a powerful job. It's a wonderful job. I'm sure you get lots of gratification. There is the problem. I don't care what your ideology is, there is the problem of human vanity. And, you know, vanity can lead us to do some things that are really quite regrettable. And I think that vanity is playing a role in this. And I'm disappointed. I certainly hope that Justice Breyer will retire soon. Like I said, immediately would be best.
Well,
And Lisa, this is why my message to Randy Kennedy is don't retire anytime soon. But do find a place for Justice Breyer on the Harvard Law faculty. Maybe that'll cushion the blow.
entice him. Well, look, you both are such great servants to the rest of us, and always provocative, Randy, always inspiring. You keep us all honest, and the book is great. Congratulations again. You can write an essay about Stephen Breyer when the time comes. And Congressman Raskin, thank you for all you do. You're just such an incredible representative up there. It's hard, I know. There's a lot of, this must be a strange culture to be in sometimes, but thank you for fighting the good fight. You guys are both welcome back anytime. For the rest of you, all of our audience, this is the book. This is what it looks like. Love the cover. Say It Loud by Randall Kennedy. Please go to our website and you can purchase it on the link in the chat or at our website. And we hope you all stay well and stay well read. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Bye, Randy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.